Okay, we're in Chapter 2, Personality Assessment, Measurement, and Research Design. And there's a little note in your PowerPoint that you should be printing the outlines that come from that chapter or that folder in Blackboard. And you should also print out the PowerPoints, the printable version of these PowerPoints, so that you can take notes right next to the PowerPoints. And if you run out of space in the front, you flip it over and you're right on the back of the page. We should have that all set up before you play the lectures. Okay. In your outline, you're going to see there's a Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. In this lecture, we're only going to get to the end of Roman numeral 2, and we'll stop there, and Roman numeral 3 will be picked up in a different lecture. So let's start with, take a look at the PowerPoint, and I want you to think about this statement. If you had to complete this statement 20 times, I am blank, what would you say? Would you say, I am female, I am a student, I am a daughter, I am a wife, I am a hard worker, I am extroverted, I am adventure seeking, whatever. You needed to go 20 times if you were given this little assignment, and you would start talking about who you are, or at least who you think you are. Here's another example of an assessment of personality traits. Is if you read these statements, which of the following statements do you agree with? I make most people laugh. I think it's okay to lie to friends if they never find out. I like to study with other people. And so on. So you would read these and you would put a check mark next to those statements that you believe represent you. Okay, we'll talk about those two examples in a minute. So in your outline, we're going to talk about sources of personality data. And what this means is, in Chapter 1, we define the term personality. Now we're going to talk about where do we get the data in the research that explores this interesting thing called personality. How do we gather data on personality traits? So we're going to talk about some different sources. And the first one is called self-report data, or S data. So know the abbreviation of these terms too. Self-report data is known as S data, and that's simply information a person reports about themselves. Self-report, obviously, themselves. Now, let's see, we're going to get these a lot, most commonly through things like questionnaires. But you can also get them through interviews, periodic reports that people give. But questionnaires is the most common type of self-report or S data that we get. And some of the different forms. Let's look at little a on your outline, unstructured. So unstructured simply means open-ended. You give the person leeway to fill something in, like the example you had at the beginning, I am blank. That's actually called a 20 statements test. That's a very popular, open-ended, unstructured personality assessment tool. And I'd like you to remember that because that really is a very common one. I am blank. It's called the 20 statements test. And it is an unstructured example of S data. Okay. The other example you saw is structured, which means ordered or controlled. And that's simply doing things like choosing from a list of trait descriptive adjectives, putting a check mark next to each adjective, or reading a list of statements, or filling out a Likert scale. So I think you've all have been exposed to Likert scales, even if you didn't know this term, Likert. Likert, or some people say Likert. Likert scales are just numerical scales that range from a small number up to a higher number, and you decide where you fall on that statement, whatever that statement might be. And you're usually given a little key, like in this case, adventurous, creative, and a whole bunch of other personality traits would be there. And the numbers would be 1 through 7, and it might say something like 1 equals this trait does not represent you at all, or 7, this trait very much represents you. And then there's all of these gradations in between, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you have to decide, to you, how adventurous do you believe you are? And you would circle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's called a Likert scale. And that's very structured. And so is the example that you saw earlier about putting a check next to statements that you agree with. Now, those statements help the researcher to establish what type of personality traits the person filling it out might have. And those are all examples of structured self-report data. And by the way, the statements that you saw, like those at the bottom, questionnaires like this are the most common structured self-report data type out there. Those are the most common. Very simple, very easy to do. You get lots of information. So again, questionnaires in which the person looks at statements and completes that. Those are the most common. Okay. In this chapter, we're going to talk about different sources of personality data. And for every one, we're going to go over advantages and disadvantages. So you'll need to know all the advantages and disadvantages of each of these sources of personality data. So, for self-report data, some advantages. Well, they're really easy to administer. And by easy, I mean they're cost and time efficient. You can give out a lot of questionnaires to a lot of people for very little money. And you get a wealth of information. You get information that no one else has access to but that target individual, because it's about themselves. So they're easy, they're cost and time efficient, and you get a wealth of information. Those are the advantages. Disadvantages of self-report data are, for this method to be effective, the person must be honest and open. But that's a problem, especially when the person's trying to portray themselves in a way that they think will be more positive. They may not want to admit to certain things that they know are indeed true about themselves. So because of that, you get a dishonest answer, and that's a disadvantage, because for these methods to be effective, the person must be honest and open. The second disadvantage or limitation to self-report data is that individuals may not always have accurate self-knowledge, meaning that they might lack insight to their true personality traits. They might think that they are extremely patient, and everyone else who knows this person says, no, they're very impulsive. Oh goodness, they're by no means patient. But they lack insight. So that's another disadvantage, not having accurate self-knowledge. And the third disadvantage or limitation is if you're using unstructured S data, there's a potential for bias due to intelligence. Because remember, unstructured S data are open-ended, like the 20 statements test. I am blank. Now, intelligence could influence the choice of words or adjectives that somebody uses to complete something like that. Even whether they can complete it 20 times, or how many different ways they could say the same personality trait. You could see how intelligence could have an influence on that. And that's not what we want. But that's a potential disadvantage of unstructured, or in general, self-report data. Okay, the second source of personality data is called O data, or observer report data. And that's simply the impressions and evaluations one person makes of another person. So we're observing someone else. Now, who's doing the observing? So let's talk about selection of observers. So the two types are, we can have a professional observer, and that's somebody paid and trained to be a professional observer. They don't know the person in advance that they're observing, or participants. They won't know them. So the professional observer is trained to assess, for example, a specific personality trait. Say, for example, leadership ability, and they go into a work setting and they watch people in a conference room work on this project, and they're a professional observer and they're observing everybody there on their leadership ability. They don't know anyone beforehand, they're not going to see them again, and they get the data. That's a professional observer. You can also use personal observers, and those are people who actually know the target individual. Their roommate, their spouse, their family member, their classmate, their employer. They have a relationship with the target individual beforehand. And they're going to shed this interesting light on the individual that we can't get from anyone else, because they're going to talk about actual natural behaviors and traits of this target individual. It's different than when somebody's in your face with a questionnaire, or when there's a stranger in the room watching you do something. We get a different picture of the person when we use personal observers. And something really great happens when we can use personal observers is we get the opportunity to assess what's known as multiple social personalities. What that term means, it's the different sides of individuals that are expressed to different people. And that's a term you need to know. Every term on the outline is you need to know. So multiple social personalities, that's how your text defines it. The different sides of individuals that are expressed to different people. What that means is we might be kind to our friends, but cruel to our enemies. We might be extremely loving to our spouse, but very distant with our family of origin. And our social personalities vary from one setting to another, depending on the relationships we have. So if you look at personal observers from that have different relationships with the target individual, you tend to get this very full picture of their multiple social personalities. And that's a really great amount of data to get on a person when we're looking at personality data. Advantages of this type of source of personality data. We'll talk about 3 key advantages. The first one, observers give us access to information that is not attainable through other sources, because we're going to get such a nice sense of natural behaviors. And that's the first advantage. The second is we can learn about the impression an individual makes on others, their relationship they have, their status in a group. You get the idea. So we look at the impression that an individual makes on other people. And another advantage is we can use multiple observers to obtain a consensus about what this person is really like, because we can assess multiple social personalities. So multiple social personalities is a true advantage of O data, and that's important to remember. Now let's go to the disadvantages or limitations of this type of data source. Is because observers are human, and they could have, if we use personal observers, have a relationship with the target individual. They come into this with biases. Mothers have a bias about their children. Roommates, spouses, depending on what day it is and how their relationship is going. You know what? Even professional observers go into situations with biases that they may not even be aware of. And we'll get subjective reports, which are biased reports, just inherently. But we don't want that. We want as objective as possible. So the fact that observers come into a situation with biases, that can lessen the accuracy of observer reports. And that is a true disadvantage or limitation. So we just have to be aware of that. Okay, third source of personality data is known as test data, or T data. Your book, that's personality data received from standardized tests or assessments. So these are often gathered in laboratory studies. You're going to put people in a situation and you're going to hold it constant. Everybody's going to be exposed to the same situation, and we're interested in how everybody responds. One in particular study that I wanted to mention is the dominance study. It's a very famous study by Megargee. It's in 1969, and you don't need to know the specific or the percentages of this study, but I do want to tell you about this study. Your book mentions it too. It's a great study to show how test data can provide really valuable information in personality research. So here's what they did. This is the dominance study by Megargee. So first of all, they took this large group of people and they just simply assessed dominance. Everybody filled out a questionnaire and they scored dominance ratings. And they took those who scored very high in dominance, and they also took those who scored very low in dominance. Everybody else they didn't use in the study. So they took those very high in dominance and those very low. And then they divided these people into groups, 4 different groups. One group was made of the same sex, but they had a high dominant man with a low dominant man. The second group was a high dominant woman with a low dominant woman. The third group, they mixed sexes. They had a high dominant man, low dominant woman. And the fourth group, a high dominant woman, low dominant man. Okay, so those are the 4 groups. And then they give them all this task. It was this box. It had nuts and bolts in it. You had to take them out. You had to figure out what goes back in. They had to rebuild this. And they're told, while you complete this task, one of you is going to be the leader and the other one will be the follower. The leader will give the instructions and the follower will carry them out, will do the tasks, because there's only 2 people in each group. So one becomes a leader and one becomes a follower. And they had to choose. The 2 in the group had to make a decision about who would be the leader and who would be the follower. So whether the groups completed the task was not important to the researchers. Who became the leader was interesting to them. Who was the dominant one in this group? So here's what they found. Probably not going to surprise you. When it was a high dominant man, low dominant man, the dominant man took the lead the vast majority of the time, about 75% of the time. And we saw similar results with women. When it was a high dominant woman with a low dominant woman, the dominant woman took the lead 70% of the time. So again, the vast majority of the time. Then with the mixed sex groups, the dominant male, low dominant female, the man, the dominant male, was the lead over the low dominant female. The man was the lead 90% of the time. When it was the other mixed sex group, when you had a high dominant female and a low dominant male, the high dominant female was the lead only 20% of the time. Even though she clearly has a higher dominance assessment, she becomes the leader only 20% of the time. The man, the low dominant man, he's the lead 80% of the time in that situation, which was super interesting to the researchers. So there were these dominance issues with mixed sex groups really interesting to them. Well, they had taped all of the conversations and everybody's in a lab, so the rooms were mic'd and everybody knew that. So what they did is they got to go back and look at all of the transcripts of all of the talking that went on in that room. And here's what they found. That even though the high dominant female was the lead only 20% of the time over the low dominant male, she almost always gave away that leader role. 91% of the time, by the way, gave the leader role to the less dominant man. So in essence, she was still dominant. She determined who the leader would be in that group. Clearly determined who the leader would be. So she was still dominant. But she showed it in a different way when she was paired with a low dominant male. So that was really interesting research. And again, you don't need to know those percentages or the outcome, but I do want you to remember that this is a dominant study by Megargee, and it is a fantastic example of how test data in a laboratory can give you great results in a controlled situation. Because if you can imagine going into the workplace, how could they have ever really gotten clean data on this? It would have been very hard, very expensive, very long, and who knows if they could have ever really gotten clean data on this. But they were able to do it in a controlled laboratory setting where everybody was involved in the same situation, and they got to look at the results. So let's look at some other types of test data. Mechanical recording devices. So these are mechanical recording devices. These are devices that record certain activities. I put an example on here of an actometer. That is a recording device of physical activity in kiddos. They sometimes wear it on their wrist or around their waist or their ankle, and it it actually measures their physical activity. So certain aspects of personality can be assessed through mechanical recording devices, but not a ton. To be quite honest, there's not a lot of personality dispositions that lend themselves to being studied by mechanical recording devices, but for the ones that do, these are a great source of test data. So that's why they're here, because when you can use them, mechanical recording devices are a good source of test data. The second, little b on your outline, physiological data, biological, physical functioning of the body. That's what we're talking about here. This again is an example of test data. So know that these are examples of test data, by the way. And physiological data can provide really great information regarding things such as a person's physiological level of arousal, blood pressure, heart rate, brain waves. All of these provide interesting information to the researchers. And I put an example in here because recently researchers have begun using something really powerful for them to gather data. And it's a functional MRI. You've all probably heard of MRIs. Well, this is called an fMRI, a functional MRI. It's a technique used to identify areas of the brain that become active when performing certain tasks. So what that means is they're looking at the amount of oxygen being processed in certain areas of the brain. That's what an fMRI does. And it lights up the different regions in different colors. Now, why this is interesting to personality researchers, excuse me, is because there is no way the target individual can fake responses. And that's really interesting. So for example, what if they had extroverts and introverts hooked up to an fMRI and they looked at the way their brain processed telling a lie? Do extroverts and introverts actually process the act of dishonesty similarly or differently? How about when an extrovert and an introvert both recount a traumatic childhood memory? Is there a difference in the way their brain processes this information? And then what could that mean? So that is really interesting to researchers. And again, really interesting because you're not able to fake responses. So again, just know that something like an fMRI is a great example of physiological data, which is a type of test data. Okay, the third type that I wanted to mention are projective techniques. And that's, as your book says, a test that presents the subject with an ambiguous stimulus. An ambiguous stimulus is just an unclear one. Ambiguous means unclear. And by the way, for projective techniques, these are purposefully ambiguous, not by chance. They're meant to be unclear. So people are presented with this ambiguous stimulus and then they're asked to describe what they see. It could be very vague pictures, it could be an ink blot. The belief is that this type of test data gets into things like wishes, fantasies, desires, the unconscious parts of someone's mind. And everyone is shown the same ambiguous stimulus. That's why it is test data. Everyone is shown the same controlled group of ambiguous stimuli and then asked to describe what they see. And an example, you've probably heard of the Rorschach ink blot test, and they look something like this. There are several cards, a dozen or so cards. People look at them, and they're really just ink blots, by the way. They really are ink blots just folded in half. But they're shown, and somebody looks at this, and people might say, oh, I see two people dancing or fighting or touching hands and kicking knees, or I see two bears coming together, or I see the negative of a face, or in the middle I see a jet or a skull or, whatever. All of those are potential answers, and people respond to what they see in this ambiguous stimulus or this ambiguous object. By the way, this type of test data, we don't diagnose people based on this. You don't come to any conclusions. It's just a way to gather some initial information and then kind of figure out next steps. But again, projective techniques are an example of test data. So, advantages of this type of personality source, this source of data. Two of them, I'll give you two advantages I'd like you to remember. The first one is that test data can help elicit behaviors that would be difficult to observe in everyday life. The experimenter can control the context or the setting and eliminate other outside influences. So you can start to test very specific hypotheses that you're interested in once you're in the data, once you're in the laboratory. And due to this standardization, it's a tough word for me, due to that, we can decrease the biases that we saw in observer data. So test data helps to decrease biases because we could have standard situations that we put everybody in. So we have less bias. You know what? I'm going to give you a third advantage as well. I'd like you to also remember, I know I mentioned this earlier, but just put a little note here too, that for physiological data under test data, it's very difficult to fake responses. So that's an advantage because it's very difficult to fake the responses for physiological data. Okay, some disadvantages or limitations of test data. Let's talk about two in particular. First of all, participants might try to guess what is being assessed, and then they alter their behavior. Even when they go into a lab, they start to wonder why they're being put in situations, or what are they doing, what are these people looking at, and it changes their natural behavior. That comes with the territory when you're conducting laboratory data, research. Another disadvantage or limitation is because they are controlled situations, often in laboratories, sometimes they're limited in helping us see patterns that occur in everyday life. When we want to generalize from the lab to everyday life, we just have to keep that in mind, that sometimes they're limited. So those are two disadvantages or limitations. Okay, the fourth source of personality data we would call L data, or life outcome data. And the definition your books gives is information that can be obtained from the events, activities, and outcomes in a person's life that are publicly available. So life outcome data, some examples. Let's look at the examples. Number of speeding tickets you get. Do you own a house? Have you ever been arrested? Have you published a book? All of these are available, and they're life outcome data. And what is interesting is that psychologists often use S data, self-report data, and O data, observer report data, to predict life outcome data. They also use early life outcome data to predict later life outcome data. An example, by the way, of using O data to predict L data, observer data to predict life outcome, is there was this interesting research where they looked at observer data, parents' observations of their children's temper tantrums. And they had parents rate the number of temper tantrums that the kiddos had when they were really young. And they made a prediction for later in life, and the researchers were able to predict life outcome data based on those observed temper tantrums when they were little. 20 to 30 years later, they were able to predict life outcome data like unemployment rates, divorce rates, income levels. What they found is kids who had the highest amounts, very highest amounts of temper tantrums, that number was correlated with negative life outcomes down the road, like lower paying jobs, more unemployment, more divorces. But the opposite was also true. Kids who had the fewest temper tantrums that were reported from the observer report had the most positive life outcome data down the road. So that's an example of using O data to predict L data. But again, we also use life outcome data to predict later life outcome data, like speeding tickets. By the way, if you've ever had speeding tickets and you get a lot in a short period of time, your insurance company does not like that. So if you get several or even 2 tickets in a short amount of time, they get very nervous, and they do things like up your premium for your car insurance, because what they're looking at is the life outcome data of getting speeding tickets, and they're predicting other life outcome data like the potential to have accidents, which cause them to have to spend money on you because they're your insurance company. To fix your car, to pay for medical expenses, to fix other people's cars. So they use that life outcome data and they change their behavior. They up your amount of money, your premium for your insurance. Life outcome data is being used on you all the time if you're on the internet, all the time. Spyware is a great example. Spyware tracks what sites we go to on the internet, and then it sends that information to marketers, and then they customize their advertisements to us and to the spam we get. So if you're out there looking for a red carpet for your house, you just happen to be doing that, you're on the internet, you're searching, you might notice that the next time you're on the internet and you're looking for something, so you're just looking at what movies are playing at the movie theater right now. And on the right-hand side of your screen, down the whole right side, are advertisements, and they are coincidentally for various stores that sell home goods, like carpets and rugs. It's not a coincidence, it's spyware. So they were tracking the searching you were doing for red carpets or red rugs, and then they run that information through programs, and they determine that this might be someone, based on this life outcome data, that would participate in these other behaviors like buying a table or other rugs or curtains, and then they're going to advertise those businesses to you. That's using life outcome data in everyday life. That happens all the time. So what are some advantages of L data? They are a great source of real life information about personality. We can see interesting correlations, like the example of the correlations between childhood temper tantrums and adult divorce rates. So they're an important source of real life information. Now, some disadvantages or limitations, the one I really want you to pay attention to is life outcomes are almost always caused by a variety of factors, not just personality characteristics. So whether we change jobs down the road may not just be due to our personality. It may be due to a lot of things, like our physical health, for example. Maybe we had something going on physically that required us to quit a particular job. We couldn't do that anymore. We had to do a different type of job. But 7 or 8 years down the road, we're able to go back to that type of job. So we switch again. That had very little to do with our personality and more to do with our physical health. So it's just important to remember that life outcomes are almost always caused by a variety of factors, not just personality characteristics or traits. So that is a disadvantage of L data. So the last thing we want to talk about is using multiple sources. Because as you noticed, each of those 4 data sources has advantages and limitations. That's just the way it is. None are perfect. All will have some advantages, all will have some disadvantages. And one way to handle that reality is called triangulation, which is defined in the PowerPoint as assessing personality with various types of data. So this is where we use multiple sources to look at the same personality construct. Therefore, we increase our confidence in the results. If we use various sources, we use self-reports and observer reports, and we try and get some test data on that individual, and we look at some life outcome data. Now we've done triangulation, and we feel more confident in those results when we start identifying what kind of personality that person has. Okay, so now we're on Roman numeral 2 on the outline, evaluation of personality measures. And what this really means is, so we just talked about how we get data to look at personality. Now this is really talking about, do we care about it? Is it good data? Should we give it the time of day? And what this means on your outline is there's 3 really important terms that you need to know: reliability, validity, and generalizability. We want in the field of personality research, our measures that are gathering personality data, we want them to have all 3 of these. We definitely want them to be reliable, valid, and generalizable. So let's talk about what each of those means. Reliability. Reliability is simply the consistency of measurement results. I would underline the term consistency. The consistency of measurement results, meaning The degree to which you get similar results again and again with repeated testing or repeated measurement. Do you get similar results? That's what we mean by consistency. There are various types of reliability mentioned in your book. I want you to know two. I want you to know about test-retest reliability and inter-rater reliability. So test-retest reliability, this, what we mean here is results should be similar over repeated testing. That's test-retest. Results should be similar, consistent, over repeated testing. If you repeat the measurement over time and the results are similar, then the measure is said to have test-retest reliability. Like if a person takes an assessment and they score very high in extroversion, being outgoing, and then they take it a month later, they take another assessment, and again they're really high, you would say that that measure is showing strong test-retest reliability. The second type, inter-rater reliability, that's the amount of agreement in the ratings of different observers who are assessing the same behavior. So it's the amount of agreement in the ratings of different observers who are assessing the same behavior. And that's really important, by the way, when we have observer data, inter-rater reliability. So if two different observers rate the same individual on something like extroversion, and both observers rate that person as being extremely high, again, that's going to show inter-rater reliability. But what if one rates that person as high in extroversion, the other one says, at best average? Now we do not have inter-rater reliability, and we have to pay attention to that. Is this measure really picking up extroversion then? We've just got to pay attention to that. If we don't have consistency across context or across repeated occasions. So the two repeated occasions would be test-retest and from one rater to another. So you have test-retest reliability and inter-rater reliability. Okay, the next term is validity. Validity is the degree to which a test or experiment measures what it was designed to measure. Sounds kind of silly, but it's extraordinarily important. If a test sets out to measure a particular construct, but it inadvertently picks something else up, that's a validity issue. So for example, say a group of researchers was looking at leadership abilities, and they go into this conference room and they set it up. And it happens to be a really small room, the table's really big and the seats are close to the walls, they've got a lot of subjects come in, their seats are really close to each other, and maybe a lot of the people in the room are really uncomfortable. People are really close to them, and it's really kind of tight in this room, and you can't even, you almost can't breathe, let alone work on this project they have us doing. And the researchers' intent was to assess leadership abilities, when really what they might be picking up is anxiety or comfort level with other people breaking your personal space. Neither one of those is leadership abilities, so we have a validity issue. This study set out to measure leadership abilities, but they might be picking up something like anxiety or comfort level with somebody in your personal space. So that's a validity concern. Another real-life example of validity is in real life. If you've been in school or had kids in school or family members in school in the last decade, you know there are lots of standardized tests being done, looking at reading, science, math. So I want to talk about math because this is a real-life concern across the U.S. right now. Lots of the assessments, the standardized tests for math, include word problems. If you've been in school in the last 10 years, you know this is true. There's lots of word problems looking at math abilities, which I think personally great. You're really going to start to get a feeling for whether this person understands math at a deeper level if you give them a real life problem, a word problem. But here's the problem. Here's the concern. Here's the validity issue. This is an assessment of math understanding. So say you've got a third grader, and this kid is a superstar in math. But this kid is, at best, average in reading. And when they take an assessment of their math abilities, which are the majority math or word problems, and they can't read the problem well for comprehension, not because they don't understand the math computational question, but they actually don't understand the words or the vocabulary, because they're just a third grader in reading level, but they might be a sixth or seventh grader in math computational understanding. But you're not going to know that, because this assessment, which is supposed to be assessing math, if we're using word problems, we're actually really also picking up reading level. And that's a validity issue. And that's a very real concern. Every state in the U.S. right now is kind of grappling with how to handle this. On a national level, they're looking at how to handle this. But that's the reality of it. So they're trying to do the best and stay as valid as possible to measure what they really intended to measure. That validity. Okay, another term is generalizability. And it says that's the degree to which the measure retains its validity across various contexts. Like, can we generalize our results across sexes? If we found these results with men, can we generalize that to women? If we found these results in one culture, can we generalize it to other cultures? So the degree to which this measure will retain its validity when we go across sexes, across cultures, across situations, that's generalizability. So one country to another, if you've done a study in one country and you believe it's a very valid study, if you're trying to see if it's valid in another country, that is a generalizability issue. And again, very important, if you're going to generalize your results, you need to pay attention to this. You need to explore this. You need to write about it in research, in different reports. So those are the three evaluation of personality measures that we need to pay attention to: reliability, validity, and generalizability. And that brings us to Roman numeral 3, and this is where we'll stop this lecture.